Chapter 3. A bedraggled figure slowly made his way up the stairs of our building and appeared at our apartment door. I didn't recognize the exhausted man until he stepped inside and collapsed into a chair. That was how much my father had changed in the course of the few weeks he had been gone. My mother, sister, brothers, and I embraced him, but our happiness lasted only a moment. It was followed by fear about what might have happened to Herschel. My father assured us that Herschel was safe, although I suspect he had doubts that he shared secretly with my mother. Father recounted that he and Herschel had joined a crowded trail of refugees heading north and east. Determined to stay ahead of the German tanks and troops, they had walked with the others, fleeing the invading soldiers from dawn to night, sleeping a few fitful hours in fields where they found their only food, ears of corn plucked right off the stalks and eaten raw. Whenever they approached a town, a rumor would sweep through their ranks that the Germans were already there. With alarming, indeed astounding speed, the Germans had taken over all of western Poland and were pushing east. Herschel was young and strong and could travel faster than my father. At the same time, my father was rethinking his impulse to leave his wife and children, and so they decided that Herschel would continue alone to Narevka, and my father would return to Krakow and take his chances with the occupying army. The travel was hazardous and slow, but he finally succeeded in reaching home. However ragged he was, I was relieved to have my father back with us. A flood of unrelenting restrictions now cascaded over us. All over Krakow, posters appeared in both Polish and German demeaning Jews, depicting us as grotesque caricatures, filthy with large, crooked noses. Nothing about these pictures made any sense to me. In my family, we didn't have many clothes, but my mother worked hard to keep them clean, and we were never dirty. I found myself studying all our noses. None was particularly big. I couldn't understand why the Germans would want to make us look like something we were not. Restrictions against Jews rapidly multiplied. It seemed like there was almost nothing Jews were still allowed to do. We were no longer permitted to sit on park benches. Then we were banned from the parks altogether. Ropes went up inside my beloved streetcars, designating seating for Gentiles, non-Jewish Poles, in the front of the cars and for Jews in the rear. At first, I found the restriction irritating because it ruined my chance to play the game of evading the conductor with my pals. Soon, there would be no chance to play my game at all, because Jews were prohibited from using any public transportation. Gradually, the boys with whom I had shared so many adventures, who had never cared that I was Jewish, started ignoring me. Then they began muttering nasty words when I was near. And finally, the cruelest of my one-time friends told me that they would never again be seen playing with a dirty Jew. My 10th birthday on September 15th, 1939, passed unnoticed amid the confusion and uncertainty of those first weeks of German occupation. Fortunately, Krakow was spared the destructive bombardments that targeted Warsaw and other cities, but even without the threat of bombs, there was terror on the streets. The German soldiers acted with utter impunity. One could never predict what they would do next. They looted Jewish businesses. They evicted Jews from their apartments and moved in, confiscating their belongings. Orthodox Jewish men were special targets. Soldiers would grab them off the street, beat them, and shave their beards and side curls, known as peyot, just for sport, or what they considered sport. And there were some Gentile Poles who also saw new opportunities. One morning, several Poles stormed our building to raid the apartment upstairs, where the Jewish family that fled to Warsaw had lived. They banged on our apartment door, and when my father refused to give them the key that had been entrusted to him, they simply raced up the stairs, broke in, and ransacked the place anyway. Within a few months, Nazi entrepreneurs arrived on the scene in the hope of making their fortune off the misery of Jewish factory owners who were no longer permitted to own a business. The glass factory where my father worked was one of those targets. The Nazi businessmen who took over the company immediately fired all the Jewish workers, all except my father. He was spared because he spoke German. The new owner made my father the official liaison, akin to a translator, between himself and the Christian Poles still allowed to work. For the first time in months, I saw my father look a tiny bit more confident. He reassured us that the war wouldn't last long, and since he had a job, we would be safe. By next year, maybe even by the end of this year, he predicted, it would all be over. Just as the Germans had left at the end of the Great War, so they would leave again. I suspect that there were Jewish parents all across Krakow who delivered similar messages to their children, not only to comfort them, but also to reassure themselves. My father was making the same mistake so many others did, believing that the Germans with whom he was dealing now were no different from the ones he had known before. He had no idea, nor could he have, of the limitless inhumanity and evil of this new enemy. One evening, just as we were sitting down for our sparse supper, without warning, 2 members of the Gestapo, the German secret police, burst through the front door of our apartment. The Poles who had pillaged our neighbor's apartment had tipped them off, telling them that we were Jews and that my father had refused to hand over the key they had demanded. Reporting him was their chance for revenge. In front of us, these thugs, who could not have been more than 18 years old, taunted my father, shouting at him to tell them where he had the key. They smashed dishes and toppled our furniture. Then they shoved my father up against the wall and demanded to know where we kept our money and jewels. I guess they really didn't take a close look at our modest apartment. They just followed their racist ideology that all Jews hoarded wealth. Despite their brutality, my father thought that he could reason with them, that by using calm logic, he could convince them that we had no money or jewels. "Look around," he said to them. "Do we seem rich?" When he realized that they weren't interested in his arguments, he did something even worse. He said he would report them to their supervisors, the Nazi officials he knew from the factory. His threats only inflamed them. They beat him with their bare fists, slammed him to the floor, and choked him. I was sickened by their ruthlessness. I wanted to run away so I didn't have to watch, but I felt like my feet were rooted in concrete. I saw the shock and shame register in my father's eyes as he lay helpless in front of his wife and children. The proud, ambitious man who had brought his family to Krakow for a better life was powerless to stop Nazi brutes who dared break into his home. Suddenly, before it registered what was happening, these brutes dragged my father out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the night. Those were the worst moments of my life. For years after, those scenes of horror replayed in my mind. In a way, that terrible episode became not only the precursor, but also the symbol for all the horrible viciousness that would follow. Up until the moment when I saw my father beaten and bloody, I had somehow felt that I was safe. I know how irrational that must seem, given what I saw happening around me, but until that evening, I had felt that I had a special immunity, that somehow the violence wouldn't touch me. In that moment, I knew different. But strangely enough, that realization made me feel that I couldn't be passive. I couldn't simply wait for the Germans to be defeated. I had to act. I had to find my father. In the days that followed, my brother David and I searched all over Krakow, trying to find where the Gestapo had taken him. We went to every police station and Nazi building, any place that had the Nazi flag draped outside. Because both my brother and I could speak German, and because the full villainy of the Germans was not yet evident, we brazenly questioned every German we thought might know something. Only now do I realize that what we did was quite simply crazy. With every German we approached, we put our lives in danger. And yet, in spite of all our efforts, we came up empty. Nobody admitted to knowing that our father had been arrested, let alone where he was being held. It was the worst possible nightmare. My sister Pesa even went with David and me to a lawyer, whom we begged to help us. He sent us home with the promise that he would find our father, although he really had no idea where to begin. With each dead end, I felt an escalating fear. I did my best to hide it and appear strong for my mother, but sometimes she shook me awake at night because I'd had another nightmare, reliving those awful moments when my father was beaten before my eyes. I tried to stop from thinking the obvious. If the Nazis could beat him in front of all of us, what might they do to him when he was out of our sight? When I thought of him suffering, I even began to feel a little bit guilty for hoping that he was still alive. I didn't want him to have to endure more beatings, or worse. Was there really any hope that he would ever return? As days turned into weeks and our hope of finding Father deteriorated, our situation became increasingly desperate. My father had kept a savings account in a Krakow bank, but those funds had disappeared when all Jewish bank accounts became the property of the Nazis. Now what little money we had was nearly gone. We had a meager emergency reserve, a secret stash of 10 gold coins that my grandmother had given my mother before we left Nerevka. One by one, my mother traded the coins for food, but all too soon the coins were gone, and with them, the only safety net we had. My mother was frantic, beside herself with fear and anxiety. In a city occupied by the enemy, away from the protective cocoon of Nerevka, she nearly broke down. Nights were especially difficult, for they were the few hours when she couldn't busy herself feeding or caring for us. She tossed restlessly in the bed. I could feel her body shudder as she cried out, "What will we do? How will we live?" I felt determined to help her somehow, to relieve her anguish, and to show her that she could rely on me. But as her youngest child, I doubt my reassurances gave her much confidence. She was on her own, weighted down with the staggering burden of sole responsibility for keeping her children and herself alive. At the beginning of December 1939, the Nazis decreed Jews could no longer attend school. When I first heard of this new restriction, I felt a brief sense of freedom. What 10-year-old wouldn't enjoy a few days off from school? But the feeling didn't last long. I quickly realized the vast difference between choosing not to go to school for a day or two and being forbidden to attend ever. It was just one more way the Nazis sought to take everything we valued away from us. But it did mean that I could join my brothers and sister in looking for a job. It wasn't easy, since there were lots of other Jewish kids doing exactly the same thing. David managed to find work as a plumber's helper, carrying his tools and assisting him on jobs. My sister worked cleaning houses. I started hanging out at a soft drink company, volunteering to put labels on the bottles. At the end of the day, I received a single bottle of soda as payment. I took it home for all of us to share. One afternoon, as I was returning from work, I spotted one of the Gestapo who had beaten my father. I was sure of it. I don't know what possessed me, but I chased after him and begged him to tell me where he had taken my father. The menacing figure stared down at me with disdain, as if I were less than a piece of lint on his coat. Had I known better, I would have been scared for my life. But I didn't, and maybe my boldness impressed him, because he told me my father was at St. Michael's prison. I raced to find David, and together we sprinted into the central city to the forbidding building. Sure enough, the authorities confirmed that our father was indeed there. Though we weren't permitted to see him, just knowing that he was alive gave us a renewed sense of purpose. Somehow, he had held out, and so could we. Our days now centered on going to the prison, taking with us packages of food carefully prepared and wrapped by my mother. As I think about it now, I realize that the Gestapo officer could have lied to me and I would not have known, but for some reason, he didn't. Several weeks later, for no apparent reason, my father was released from prison. The moment he came through our door was one of overwhelming relief and joy. At the same time, it brought an unexpected sadness. It was easy to see that what he had gone through had changed him. It wasn't just that he was weak and gaunt. He was changed in a more fundamental way. The Nazis had not only stripped him of his strength, although he would find a great reserve of it in the years ahead, but also of his confidence, that sense of self-esteem that had put a spring in his step and made him stand straight and tall. Now he spoke little and walked with downcast eyes. He had lost his job at the glass factory, and he had lost something even more precious, his dignity as a human being. It shook me to the core to see my father defeated. If he couldn't stand up to the Nazis, how could I? As 1939 drew to an end, I realized that my father's prediction had been wrong. Our situation seemed dire in every way. All signs pointed to the war going on for a long time. The Nazis were not content with what they had already inflicted on us Jews. Each day brought a new humiliation. If a German soldier approached, Jews had to get off the sidewalk until he passed by. In late November, we were required to identify ourselves as Jews by wearing a white armband with a blue Star of David that we had to purchase from the Jewish Council, the governing body the Nazis had appointed to deal with all Jewish matters. To be caught without the armband meant arrest and most likely torture and death. Since I was not yet 12, I wasn't required to wear the armband identification. And when I was old enough to wear it, I made up my mind not to, even though my confidence had been shaken by what I had experienced and seen. There were times when I disobeyed the rules and thumbed my nose at the Nazis. In a way, I used their own stereotypes against them, since there was nothing about me that made it obvious I was a Jew. With my thick, dark hair and blue eyes, I looked like a lot of other Polish boys. So now and then I would go and sit on a park bench just to prove that I could do what I wanted, resisting the Nazis in my own small way. Of course, I couldn't do that when anyone who knew me was around. The friends with whom I used to play now looked the other way when I was near. I don't know if they would have betrayed me, but most likely they would have, in an attempt to obliterate their memory of how they had once played with a Jew. I watched them walk to school in the mornings as if nothing had changed, when for me, everything had. I was no longer the happy-go-lucky, adventurous boy who had gleefully looked forward to missing a day of school. My father found his own way to defy the Nazis and to help us survive at the same time, even though it meant doing something illegal. He worked on the sly, off the books, so to speak, for the glass company on Lipova Street. One day, he was sent across the street to Lipova Street 4, to the enamelware factory where he sometimes had repaired tools and equipment before the war. The new owner, a Nazi, needed a safe opened. My father asked no questions, but pulled out the correct tools and quickly cracked open the safe. It turned out to be the best thing he ever did, since quite unexpectedly, the Nazi offered him a job. I've often wondered what my father thought at that moment. Did he feel relief or only a different anxiety about what this Nazi would ask him to do next? He knew that whatever wages he earned would never reach his hand, but would go straight to the Nazi. In other words, accepting the offer of a job meant working for free. But working there also meant the chance of protection for himself and his family. There might be someone to stand between him and the next Nazis to come to his door. It was worth a try. And refusing really wasn't an option. Maybe he sensed that there was something decent about this particular Nazi, or maybe beaten down, as he already was, and ready to grab onto the thinnest lifeline of hope, he just thought, do as you're told, don't make trouble, show your value, survive. Whatever his motivation, my father accepted the job on the spot. By doing so, he set in motion far more than he could ever have imagined. The Nazi businessman whose safe he cracked was Oskar Schindler.